Hey there. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most complex, contradictory, and utterly fascinating figures in all of Greek mythology. Not a warrior god who solved problems with thunderbolts, not a wise goddess dispensing strategy from marble halls. No, we're talking about Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, theater, and everything your ancient Greek parents probably warned you about. The god who could bring ecstatic joy or tear you limb from limb, depending on whether you honored him. The twice-born deity who walked the line between civilization and chaos, between the divine and the mortal, between sanity and beautiful, terrible madness. If this kind of deep exploration helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it brings you peace. And let me know in the comments who your favorite Greek god is. Now settle in, let the wine pour, let the ancient world unfold. And let's begin with a birth that should have been impossible. Long before Dionysus became the god of wine and revelry, before he taught humanity to cultivate the grape and lose themselves in ecstatic dance, before he earned his place among the 12 Olympians, there was Semele. And Semele, unfortunately for her, caught the eye of Zeus. Semele was a mortal princess of Thebes, daughter of Cadmus, the city's founder, and Harmonia, herself the daughter of Ares and Aphrodite. So Semele had divine blood in her lineage, though she herself was fully mortal. Ancient sources describe her as the youngest of Cadmus's daughters, and based on how the myths unfold, her beauty must have been extraordinary to catch Zeus's attention so completely. The kind of beauty that made gods forget their wedding vows. And Zeus, as we know, had a particular talent for forgetting his wedding vows. The king of the gods noticed Semele one day, probably from his vantage point high on Mount Olympus, and decided he simply had to have her. The details of their courtship vary depending on which ancient text you consult. Different poets and historians offered different versions, as was common with Greek myths. What the sources agree on is that their relationship produced a pregnancy. What all sources agree on is this: Semele and Zeus became lovers, and Semele became pregnant with his child. Now, if you know anything about Greek mythology, you know that Zeus having an affair with a mortal woman is about as surprising as the sun rising in the east. It happened constantly. What made Semele's situation particularly tragic was the timing, the place, and most importantly, Hera's discovery of the affair. Hera, queen of the gods, goddess of marriage, and patron saint of divine vengeance, was Zeus's wife, and she was tired. So very tired of her husband's wandering eye and wandering everything else. Each affair was a personal insult, each illegitimate child a reminder of her humiliation. But Hera had learned over the centuries that direct confrontation with Zeus rarely ended well for anyone. He was, after all, the most powerful being in the cosmos. So Hera got creative, she got subtle, she got absolutely devastatingly clever. Hera's terrible deception. When Hera learned that Semele was pregnant with Zeus's child, she disguised herself as an old woman. The most common version identifies her as taking the form of Semele's elderly nurse, Bero, though some sources simply describe her as a kind old crone. Either way, the disguise was perfect. And in this guise, Hera befriended Semele. Picture it: Semele, young and in love, carrying the child of the king of the gods, confiding in this sweet old woman who seemed to understand her fears and joys. The disguised Hera listened patiently, sympathetically, as Semele gushed about her divine lover. And then, so carefully, so delicately, Hera began to plant seeds of doubt. "How wonderful that you have such a powerful lover," Hera might have said, her voice trembling with false excitement. "But my dear, are you certain he's really Zeus? I mean, truly certain. Many men claim to be gods to seduce young women. It's a tale as old as time." Semele, of course, insisted that her lover was indeed Zeus. She'd seen his power, felt his presence, but the seed was planted. The doubt had taken root. "Well," Hera continued, twisting the knife with the skill of centuries of pain, "if he truly is Zeus, then surely he would show you his full glory, wouldn't he? That's what he does for his wife, after all. When Zeus comes to me, he comes in his true form, with all his divine majesty. If he loves you as he claims, wouldn't he do the same?" The poison was elegant in its simplicity. Hera knew exactly what would happen. She knew the laws that governed gods and mortals. She knew that no mortal could look upon a god in their true, undiluted form and survive. The divine radiance, the raw power, it would incinerate any human foolish enough to witness it. But she also knew that Zeus, bound by his own pride and his oaths, would not refuse if asked properly. So Semele, her mind now clouded with doubt and desire, waited for Zeus's next visit. And when he came to her, she made him swear an oath, not just any oath, but an oath upon the river Styx, the most binding promise any god could make, a promise that, once spoken, could not be broken without cosmic consequences. "Swear to me," Semele asked, "that you will grant me anything I desire." Zeus, caught up in the moment, drunk on affection or lust or both, swore the oath. He promised on the Styx that he would give her whatever she wanted. The words left his mouth, and the cosmos itself took note. The oath was sealed. "Show yourself to me," Semele said, "as you appear to Hera. Come to me in your full glory, your true form." And Zeus's heart, if gods truly have hearts, must have plummeted, the burning truth. Zeus knew immediately what he had done. The ancient texts tell us he begged her to reconsider, to ask for anything else. Riches, immortality for her mortal family, a palace of gold, anything. But the oath was sworn, and Semele, convinced this was the ultimate proof of his love, insisted. Some versions of the story say Zeus tried to spare her by appearing in the smallest manifestation of his power he could manage, the weakest thunderbolt, the sparsest lightning, the barest hint of storm clouds. It didn't matter. The gap between divine and mortal was too vast, too fundamental. When Zeus revealed himself, Semele was consumed. The ancient sources describe it in various ways, each more terrible than the last. Lightning enveloped her, flames erupted from nowhere and everywhere at once. Her mortal flesh, unable to withstand the presence of pure divinity, simply burned away. Some accounts say she screamed, others that she was incinerated too quickly for sound. But the result was the same. Semele, princess of Thebes, lover of Zeus, died in an instant, consumed by the very glory she had demanded to see. Hera, watching from Olympus, or perhaps from the shadows of that very room, must have smiled. But Zeus, grieving and furious with himself, was not going to let his child die with its mother. As Semele burned, as her body disintegrated in divine fire, Zeus acted with the desperate speed that only a god can manage. He plunged into the flames and rescued the unborn child from Semele's womb. The fetus, barely formed, still fragile and mortal, would have died instantly if left to the elements. So Zeus did something unprecedented. something that would earn this child a title no other god could claim. He cut open his own thigh and sewed the fetal Dionysus inside. The child would complete his gestation not in a mother's womb, but in the leg of the king of the gods himself. Zeus would carry his son for the remaining months, hidden from Hera's sight, protected by divine flesh and immortal blood. This is why Dionysus would later be called the twice-born. Born once from his mother, Semele, and born again from the thigh of his father, Zeus, the only god to have two births, two entries into the world, a being caught between mortal and divine from the very moment of his conception. When the time came, when the pregnancy had run its course, Zeus opened his thigh and brought Dionysus forth into the world. The child was born divine, immortal, perfect. He had horns, some sources say, small and crescent-shaped like the moon. He had the marks of divinity upon him from the start, but he also carried something else written into his very nature, though whether this was conscious knowledge or simply part of his divine essence is a question the myths don't answer. The trauma of his mother's death, the understanding that the divide between mortality and divinity was vast and often tragic, that love between gods and mortals carried devastating risks. Semele's death was not the end of her story, but that comes later. For now we have an infant god, born under circumstances that would make anyone else wary of the world. Born into a cosmos where his father's wife hated him for existing, where his very birth had cost his mother everything, where he existed as living proof of Zeus's infidelity. Hera was not finished with him, not even close, a childhood of hiding and madness. You might think that being born from Zeus's thigh would grant you some protection, some divine immunity from the petty cruelties of the immortal world. You would be wrong. Hera's hatred didn't dissipate with Semele's death. If anything, it intensified. This child, this Dionysus, was a constant reminder of her humiliation, and Hera was nothing if not persistent in her vengeance. Zeus, knowing his wife's capacity for creative punishment, had to hide his newborn son. The first caretakers were the nymphs of Mount Nysa, though ancient sources never quite agreed on where Nysa actually was. Herodotus placed it in Ethiopia beyond Egypt. Others suggested Thrace, Libya, Arabia, or various locations in Asia Minor. The geography mattered less than the secrecy. These nymphs, often called the Hyades in some traditions, raised Dionysus in a hidden location, far from Hera's watchful gaze. With them was Silenus, the wise and perpetually drunk satyr, who would become Dionysus's lifelong companion and teacher. Silenus was old, even by immortal standards, with the pot-belly and balding head of someone who enjoyed wine far more than exercise. But he was also learned, kind, and most importantly, loyal. He taught young Dionysus about the natural world, about the secrets of the earth and growing things. For a time, the child was safe. For a time, he was simply a divine child, learning about the world, discovering his powers, growing into himself. The nymphs loved him. Silenus doted on him. It was as close to a normal childhood as a god born from tragedy could have. But Hera found him. The myths don't tell us precisely how Hera located him, whether through divine sight, whispered information, or simple persistence in searching every corner of the world. But she found him, and when she did, she struck. When she did, she struck him with madness. This wasn't the ecstatic, joyful madness that Dionysus would later become known for. This was something darker, more terrifying. A madness that tore at the mind, that sent the young god wandering through the world without purpose or sense. Some accounts say he frothed at the mouth. Others describe him as being driven by invisible furies, unable to rest, unable to think clearly. Dionysus, still young and vulnerable despite his divinity, fled. He wandered through Egypt, through Syria, through the wild lands beyond the edges of Greek civilization. He was a god gone mad, stumbling through deserts and forests, his mind fractured by Hera's curse. And then, in his wandering, something happened, something that would change everything. He discovered the grapevine, the discovery of wine. Different sources place the discovery of the vine in different lands. Some traditions locate it in Nysa during his childhood. Others say it happened during his wanderings through Asia. The location varied, but what remained consistent was the revelation itself. Dionysus understood what could be done with the grape. This wasn't just food, this was something more. The grapes, when crushed and left to ferment, produced a liquid that could ease pain, lower inhibitions, bring joy, and yes, induce a kind of madness. But this madness was different from the curse Hera had placed upon him. This was a madness he could control, could direct, could share. Wine became Dionysus's gift and his weapon. It was medicine and poison in the same cup. It could bring people together in celebration or drive them to violence. It could liberate or destroy. It was, in every way, a perfect reflection of its discoverer, a god born between worlds, between sanity and madness, between joy and suffering. As Dionysus mastered his discovery, as he learned to cultivate grapes and perfect the process of fermentation, something else happened. The madness Hera had inflicted began to transform. Or perhaps Dionysus learned to incorporate it into himself, to make it part of his nature rather than something inflicted upon him. The frenzied wandering became divine ecstasy. The inability to think clearly became transcendent experience. The curse became a gift, though a dangerous one. This transformation was not instantaneous. The myths suggest Dionysus wandered for years, perhaps decades. He traveled through lands the Greeks barely knew, places where their civilization hadn't yet spread. He learned from other gods, other traditions. His cult absorbed elements from Phrygia, from Thrace, from Egypt. He became a cosmopolitan deity, a god of borders and crossings, of the space between the civilized and the wild. Silenus and the nymphs who had raised him eventually found him again, or perhaps he found them. When they reunited, Dionysus was changed. He was no longer a frightened child fleeing Hera's wrath. He was a god in full, master of the vine, bearer of gifts and curses alike. He gathered followers as he traveled. Satyrs, those half-goat companions who delighted in wine and celebration. Maenads, the women who would become his most devoted and most terrifying worshippers. And he began to teach humanity what he had discovered. Teaching humanity. Imagine you're a Bronze Age farmer, breaking your back in the fields, life measured in seasons and harvests, every day a struggle against hunger and nature. And then this strange, beautiful, androgynous figure appears, traveling with a ragged band of revelers. He shows you a plant you might have seen before, a vine that produces small, sweet fruits. But he shows you something more. He shows you transformation. Dionysus didn't just give humanity wine. He gave them viticulture, the art and science of growing grapes. He taught them which varieties grew best in which soils, how to prune the vines, when to harvest, how to prepare the grapes for fermentation. This wasn't divine magic appearing from nowhere. This was practical knowledge, the kind of education that would shape Mediterranean civilization for millennia. But the gift came with warnings, though whether mortals listened to those warnings is another question entirely. Wine, Dionysus taught, must be mixed with water. To drink it pure was to court disaster, to invite the kind of madness that destroyed rather than liberated. The Greeks would take this teaching to heart, viewing anyone who drank unmixed wine as a barbarian or a fool. Dionysus traveled from city to city, region to region, sometimes welcomed, sometimes rejected. His methods of teaching varied. Sometimes he appeared as a wise foreigner, offering his knowledge freely. Other times he worked through dreams, through visions, through the subtle influence of a god who could move between the visible and invisible worlds. And everywhere he went, he established his cult, not the grand state-sponsored worship of gods like Zeus or Athena, but something more personal, more intense. His followers didn't just pray to him, they became him, if only for the duration of the ritual. They wore his sacred ivy and fawn skins. They carried the thyrsus, a giant fennel stalk wrapped in ivy and topped with a pine cone. They drank his wine and danced until exhaustion or ecstasy or both claimed them. The worship of Dionysus was transgressive by design. It broke down social barriers. Slaves and free people celebrated together. Men and women, normally separated in Greek society, mixed freely. The civilized Greeks would venture into the wild mountains to howl and dance and tear through the forest. It was liberation from the strictures of daily life, a sanctioned chaos that allowed people to experience something beyond the normal bounds of existence. But it was also dangerous, because Dionysus didn't just offer wine and celebration. He offered the ability to lose yourself completely, to step outside your identity and become something else. And not everyone who took that step found their way back. The Maenads, his female followers, were particularly concerning to ancient Greek society. These women, ordinary citizens and housewives and mothers, would leave their homes and families to celebrate in the mountains. They would achieve a state of possession, becoming vessels for the gods' power. In this state, ancient sources tell us they gained supernatural strength. They could nurse wild animals one moment and tear them apart with their bare hands the next. They uprooted trees, outran armed men, and seemed impervious to weapons or cold or pain. This practice, called sparagmos, the ritual tearing apart of animals, and homophagia, the eating of raw flesh, was both religious sacrament and terrifying spectacle. The Maenads believed they were consuming the god himself, incorporating his divine essence into their bodies. It was communion taken to its most primal extreme. Ancient Greeks told stories of Maenads who, in their frenzy, mistook human beings for wild beasts. Stories of sons torn apart by their own mothers. Stories of men who spied on the sacred rites and paid with their lives. Whether those tales were literal truth, metaphorical warnings, or a mix of both, they served a purpose. They communicated something essential about Dionysus and his worship. This was not a safe god. This was not a deity you could approach casually. Respect was not optional. It was survival. Dionysus himself seemed to delight in this duality. He was the smiling god who brought joy and release from suffering. He was also the punisher of those who rejected him, who denied his divinity, or tried to suppress his worship, and his punishments were rarely quick or merciful. The ancient world was full of gods who demanded respect. What made Dionysus different was the totality of transformation he offered. Other gods might bless you or curse you while you remained fundamentally yourself. Dionysus offered, or inflicted, the chance to become something entirely other. And that opportunity, that danger, terrified and attracted people in equal measure. As his cult spread, as more and more of humanity learned to cultivate the vine and perform his rites, Dionysus himself was changing, or perhaps revealing more of what he had always been. He was becoming the god of theatre, of masks and performances, the god of transformation and fluidity, the god who walked the line between male and female, between Greek and barbarian, between human and animal, between sanity and divine madness. And soon he would return to the place of his birth, to Thebes, where his mother had died and where his family had spread lies about his origins, to Thebes, where his own cousin sat on the throne and would make the fatal mistake of denying Dionysus's divinity, to Thebes, where the god would prove once and for all that he was not to be trifled with. But before we get to that terrible homecoming, we need to understand what wine truly meant to the ancient world, and what Dionysus represented beyond the simple joy of intoxication. Wine, liberation, and destruction in the ancient world was not what we think of today when we uncork a bottle with dinner. It was medicine, currency, religious offering, social lubricant, and dangerous drug all rolled into one. It was the primary safe beverage for much of the Mediterranean world, where water sources were often contaminated. Mixed properly with water, wine could kill bacteria and make otherwise unsafe water drinkable. It saved countless lives simply by existing. But wine was also power, the ability to produce it, to trade it, to control its distribution. These were markers of wealth and civilization. Dionysus, in teaching humanity viticulture, had given them an industry that would shape economies for thousands of years. Wine became a commodity, a luxury, a necessity. Entire regions built their prosperity on grape cultivation. Wars were fought over wine-producing territories. And then there was wine's effect on consciousness, which the ancients understood perhaps better than we do today. They knew wine could reveal truth, loosen tongues, lower barriers between people. The symposium, the ancient Greek drinking party, was where politics happened, where philosophy was debated, where social bonds were formed and tested. Wine facilitated these crucial social functions. But they also knew wine's dangers. Unmixed wine could lead to violence, to loss of control, to decisions that destroyed lives. The Greeks had a word, hubris, that often accompanied too much wine. They told cautionary tales of centaurs who drank unmixed wine and attacked wedding guests, of gods who got drunk and made terrible choices, of humans who lost everything to their inability to moderate their consumption. Dionysus embodied this duality perfectly. He was the god who could bring people together in joyful celebration, who could ease suffering and create moments of transcendent happiness. He was also the god who could drive you mad, who could make you tear your own child apart, who could transform your greatest joy into your deepest trauma. This made him fundamentally different from the other Olympian gods. Zeus might strike you with a thunderbolt if you angered him, but that was external power, force applied from outside. Dionysus worked from within. His gifts and curses alike came from inside you, from the loosening of your own inhibitions, from the dismantling of the walls between your civilized self and something more primal. The Greeks didn't fully trust him, and with good reason, but they also couldn't ignore him. To reject Dionysus was to reject something fundamental about human nature, about the need for release, for transformation, for moments when the normal rules didn't apply. Every culture that encountered him felt this tension. You couldn't fully embrace him without risking chaos, but you couldn't fully reject him without denying a vital part of existence. And so his worship persisted, evolved, spread. From the wild mountain dances of Thrace to the organized state festivals of Athens, from the secret mystery cults that promised initiated members a better afterlife to the public theaters where his name was invoked before every performance. Dionysus became woven into the fabric of ancient society in ways both visible and hidden. But acceptance was never guaranteed. Even as his cult spread, even as wine became central to Mediterranean life, there were always those who resisted, who saw his worship as dangerous, his influence as corrosive, his very existence as a threat to order and civilization. These resistors learned, one by one, why refusing a god was the worst decision a mortal could make. And nowhere was this lesson taught more brutally than in the city of Thebes, where Dionysus was born, where his mother died, and where his own family would pay the price for their denial. Years had passed since Semele's death. Thebes had prospered under the rule of Cadmus, who eventually grew old and weary of power. He handed the throne to his grandson Pentheus, son of his daughter Agave and Echion, one of the Spartoi, the warriors who'd sprung from dragons' teeth when Cadmus first founded the city. Pentheus was young when he assumed the throne, ancient sources suggesting around 20 or 21 years old. He took his responsibilities with the intensity that young rulers often do. He was everything a traditional Greek king should be: strong, decisive, committed to maintaining social order. He saw the world in clear divisions: civilization versus chaos, order versus disorder, proper behavior versus improper behavior. And Pentheus intended to keep Thebes firmly on the side of civilization. Meanwhile, his aunt Semele's son had grown into full godhood. Dionysus had traveled the known world, established his worship in distant lands, and gathered followers who would follow him anywhere. He had become a god in full, recognized everywhere except the one place that should have honored him most: his birthplace. Because in Thebes, Semele's sisters had been spreading a different version of events for years. Agave, Ino, and Altanoe claimed their sister had lied about Zeus being her lover. According to their story, Semele had become pregnant by some mortal man, and then blasphemously claimed the king of the gods was responsible. Zeus, offended by the lie, struck her down with his thunderbolt as punishment. It was meant to be a cautionary tale about hubris and falsehood. It was also entirely false, but the lie had persisted for years, repeated so often it became accepted truth. Dionysus, in this telling, was not a god but a pretender, the bastard child of a lying woman, someone to be dismissed or ignored. The people of Thebes made no offerings to him, built no temples, sang no hymns. It was as if he didn't exist. This rejection cut deeper than any wound. This wasn't some distant city that had never heard of him. This was Thebes, the city of his mother's birth and death. This was family denying family. This was his own blood relatives erasing his divine nature and his mother's honor. So Dionysus came home. He arrived disguised as a mortal, a beautiful, androgynous young man, leading a procession of Asian maenads, women who sang and danced and carried the Dionysus. He looked young, almost feminine, with long hair and soft features. Nothing about his appearance suggested the terrible power he carried. He was just another mysterious foreigner bringing yet another strange Eastern cult to Greek shores. But his arrival coincided with something disturbing. Every woman in Thebes, from the youngest maiden to the oldest grandmother, suddenly abandoned their homes and fled to Mount Cithaeron. They were driven by a divine madness, a compulsion they couldn't resist. Among them were Pentheus's own mother Agave and his aunts Ino and Autonoe, the very women who had spread lies about Dionysus's parentage. Pentheus, watching his kingdom's women disappear into the mountains to engage in who knows what kind of improper behavior, was furious. This was exactly the kind of chaos he had sworn to prevent. Foreign gods bringing disorder, undermining proper social hierarchies, making women abandon their domestic duties. It was intolerable. When the disguised Dionysus was brought before him, Pentheus saw only what he expected to see: an effeminate foreigner, a charlatan leading gullible women astray with wine and false promises of divine revelation. He ordered Dionysus imprisoned, chained, and the maenads arrested. The confrontation between Pentheus and Dionysus unfolds most completely in Euripides' tragedy The Bacchae, written late in the playwright's life and performed posthumously around 405 BCE. In this version, which became the most influential telling, we see two worldviews collide. Pentheus represents rigid order, masculine authority, the power of the state to control behavior. Dionysus embodies fluidity, transformation, the power of divine ecstasy to overturn all human hierarchies. And from the very first exchange, it's clear who holds the real power. Pentheus tries to intimidate Dionysus. He threatens torture, asks mocking questions about this god he doesn't believe in. Dionysus responds with calm, almost playful answers. When Pentheus orders him chained, the chains fall off. When guards try to bind him, they bind a bull instead, or wrestle with shadows. When Pentheus locks him in a stable, an earthquake shakes the palace, fire erupts, and Dionysus walks out unharmed. This is divine power operating on a different level than mortals can comprehend. Pentheus thinks he's dealing with a man, someone who can be controlled through physical force. He doesn't yet understand that he's engaged in a contest with a god, and that he's already lost. A messenger arrives with reports from the mountain. The women aren't engaging in drunken orgies, as Pentheus assumed. They're performing wonders. They strike rocks with their thiazoi, and water springs forth. They nurse wild animals, like infants. And when local men try to capture them, the women fight back with supernatural strength, wounding armed warriors with nothing but fennel stalks, scattering trained soldiers. Pentheus's response is to ready his army, to march on the mountain and drag these women back by force. But Dionysus offers an alternative. Wouldn't it be better, the god suggests, to spy on them first, to see with your own eyes what they're doing before taking military action? And for that, of course, Pentheus would need to disguise himself, to dress as a woman, a maeanad, to blend in. Here's where the narrative becomes deeply disturbing. Pentheus, who has been unwavering in his rigid masculinity and authority, agrees. Ancient commentators and modern scholars have debated whether this represents divine possession, psychological manipulation, or both. The text describes him becoming increasingly entranced, his perception altered, though no wine has touched his lips. He allows Dionysus to dress him in women's clothing, arrange his hair, adjust his robes. He worries about his appearance. His grip on reality is fragmenting. Dionysus has driven him mad without Pentheus even realizing it. They make their way to Mount Cithaeron, Pentheus in his absurd disguise, Dionysus guiding him gently, almost tenderly, toward his doom. When they arrive at the sacred grove where the women dance, Pentheus can't see them clearly from the ground. He wants a better vantage point. Dionysus, with supernatural strength, bends a tall fir tree down to the ground, places Pentheus at its top, and slowly releases it, straightening the tree with the king visible high in the branches. The Maenads see him immediately. Later traditions and artistic interpretations have explored what happened next. Was it divine madness that made the women see Pentheus as prey? Was it the frenzied state of their worship that transformed their perception? Ancient sources suggest Dionysus altered how they saw him, making Agave believe her son was a mountain lion. The mechanics matter less than the terrible result. The motivation matters less than the outcome. The women attacked. According to Euripides' account, they first threw stones and branches. When that failed to dislodge him, they uprooted the entire tree with their bare hands, demonstrating the superhuman strength that possession by the god could grant. Pentheus fell. Led by Agave, Pentheus' own mother, the Maenads tore him from the tree. He tried to reason with them, to reveal himself, to beg for mercy. "Mother, it's me, Pentheus, your son." But Agave, foam at her mouth, eyes rolling in divine frenzy, saw only prey. What followed was Sparagos in its most horrific form, the ritual tearing apart of the sacrifice, but this time the sacrifice was human. Agave, his own mother, led the attack. Ancient sources record that Pentheus tried desperately to make her see him, removing his headdress and crying out, "Mother, it's me, Pentheus, your son." But in her possessed state, she saw only a wild beast that needed to be destroyed. When the frenzy faded, when Agave returned to Thebes, carrying what she thought was a lion's head mounted on a thyrsus, she was greeted by her father Cadmus, and slowly, gently, with the kind of heartbreak that comes from watching your child realize the horror they've committed, Cadmus brought her back to herself. The moment when Agave realizes what she's holding, that the trophy she believed to be a lion's head is actually her son's severed head, represents one of the most devastating scenes in all of Greek tragedy. Cadmus, her father, guides her back to sanity with agonizing gentleness. Her mind clears. The God-sent madness recedes, and she understands what her hands have done. The ancient texts describe her weeping, trying to piece together what happened, asking how, why, what possessed her. Dionysus reveals himself in his divine form to the devastated family. The god explains their punishment. They denied his divinity, slandered his mother's memory, and rejected his worship. He gave them direct, undeniable proof of his power, though the cost was catastrophic. Cadmus, the old king, tries to argue that the punishment was excessive. Yes, they were wrong to deny Dionysus, but did the god truly need to destroy his own cousin so completely? Couldn't divine justice have been more measured? Dionysus's response is chilling in its simplicity. You learned this too late. The god pronounces sentence on the family. Agave and her sisters are exiled from Thebes. Cadmus and his wife Harmonia will eventually be transformed into serpents. The royal house that Cadmus built is shattered, its legacy of denial paid for in blood and madness. And with that, Dionysus's revenge on Thebes is complete. His mother is vindicated, his divinity proven beyond any doubt. The city that rejected him now knows exactly what he is capable of. The pattern of punishment, the story of Pentheus, wasn't unique. Across the Greek world, Dionysus encountered resistance from those who didn't understand what he represented, who saw his worship as dangerous or barbaric, who tried to suppress his cult through force or mockery. And in each case, the god's vengeance followed a similar pattern. The denier was driven mad and destroyed, often by their own actions or by the people closest to them. King Lycurgus of Thrace made a fatal error when he attempted to imprison Dionysus and drive the god's followers from his land. According to various sources, Dionysus struck him with such severe madness that Lycurgus mistook his own son for a grapevine that needed pruning. He killed the boy with an axe, hacking at him before understanding what he'd done. The land of Thrace became barren afterward, and some traditions hold that Lycurgus's own people, desperate to restore fertility, tore their king apart on Mount Pangaeus. The daughters of King Minyas of Orchomenos refused to abandon their looms to join the Bacchic celebrations. They insisted on remaining inside, working as proper women should. Dionysus appeared to them first as a young girl, attempting to persuade them gently. When they rejected even this, he transformed himself into a lion, a bull, and a panther. The visions drove them to madness. In their frenzy, they drew lots, and the one who drew the short lot saw her own child torn apart by the others. They fled to the mountains, and in some versions were eventually transformed into bats, creatures doomed to flee from light forever. Perhaps the most well-known punishment involved pirates who tried to kidnap what appeared to be a wealthy, helpless youth. Different sources identify these as Tyrrhenian pirates. They bound Dionysus to the ship's mast, intending to sell him as a slave or hold him for ransom. But the ropes kept falling away. The helmsman, recognizing something divine about their captive, urged the crew to release him immediately. They refused. So Dionysus showed them what happens when you try to bind a god. Suddenly, wine began flowing across the deck. Ivy grew from nowhere, wrapping around the mast and rigging. The sound of flutes filled the air, though no one was playing. Dionysus transformed into a lion and summoned phantom bears and panthers. The terrified pirates, all except the wise helmsman who had warned them, threw themselves overboard. As they hit the water, they transformed into dolphins, condemned to spend eternity in the sea they had sailed, their human forms lost forever. The helmsman, who had recognized divinity and urged caution, was spared and rewarded. This was the other side of Dionysus's nature. Those who honored him, who approached his worship with respect and openness, found joy, ecstasy, divine favor. Those who rejected or mocked him found madness and ruin. This pattern established Dionysus's reputation across the ancient world. He was not a forgiving god. He was not patient with skeptics or gentle with those who denied him. But he was also not capricious. The punishments, however terrible, were always responses to rejection, or mockery. Honor the god, participate willingly in his rites, and you would know only the joyful side of his madness. Reject him, and you would learn why even the other Olympians treated him with a certain wariness. Love and loss, Ariadne. But Dionysus wasn't only a god of vengeance and madness, he was also capable of love, of gentleness, of rescue and renewal. And nowhere is this shown more clearly than in his relationship with Ariadne, the Cretan princess who became his divine consort. Ariadne's story begins with another hero entirely. She was the daughter of King Minos of Crete and his wife Pasiphae. Her half-brother was the Minotaur, the bull-headed monster that lived in the labyrinth beneath the palace. Every year, Athens was forced to send 7 youths and 7 maidens to Crete as tribute, sacrifices to feed the Minotaur. When Theseus, Prince of Athens, arrived as one of these tributes, determined to kill the Minotaur and end the cruel practice, Ariadne saw him and fell in love immediately. She gave him a ball of thread to unwind as he entered the labyrinth, ensuring he could find his way back out after slaying the monster. With her help, Theseus succeeded. He killed the Minotaur, followed the thread back to freedom, and as promised, took Ariadne with him when he fled Crete. They sailed away together, heading for Athens, where they would presumably marry and live out their days. But they stopped at the island of Naxos to rest, to resupply, to take a breath before the final journey home. And on Naxos, everything changed. The details of why Theseus left her vary dramatically across sources. Some traditions claim he deliberately abandoned her, perhaps worried about bringing home the daughter of Athens' enemy. Others say Dionysus appeared to Theseus in a dream, commanding him to leave Ariadne because she was destined to become the god's wife. Still other versions suggest Theseus simply forgot her in his haste to depart, the result of divine intervention that clouded his memory. A few accounts even state that Ariadne was ill and Theseus left her to recover, intending to return, but being prevented by storms. Whatever the reason, Ariadne woke on the beach of Naxos to find Theseus's ship already disappearing over the horizon. The man she had risked everything for, the hero she had saved at the cost of betraying her own family, was sailing away. She was alone on an unfamiliar island, cut off from her homeland, abandoned by her lover, with nothing but uncertainty ahead. Some versions describe her contemplating suicide in that moment, standing on the beach with tears streaming down her face. Others portray her rage, cursing Theseus's name and crying out to the gods for justice. The emotional landscape varied, but her despair was consistent across the traditions, and that's when Dionysus found her. The god was traveling with his retinue of followers, satyrs and maenads, his chariot drawn by panthers or leopards in most artistic depictions. He saw Ariadne weeping on the shore and, according to the traditions that survive, was moved by both her beauty and her sorrow. Here was someone who had given everything for love and been cast aside. Someone who understood loss and betrayal. Dionysus approached her gently. In some versions, he offered her wine to ease her pain. In others, he spoke words of comfort, assuring her that Theseus's loss was his gain. He courted her, not with force or trickery, but with genuine affection and respect. He offered her a choice: remain mortal and eventually fade, or join him as his divine consort and live forever among the gods. Ariadne, possibly still in shock, possibly seeing in Dionysus's eyes a love more genuine than anything Theseus had offered, agreed. Their wedding on Naxos became the stuff of legend. Dionysus gave Ariadne a crown made of gold and studded with jewels from India, crafted by Hephaestus himself. When the ceremony concluded, Dionysus took this crown and flung it into the sky, where it became the constellation Corona Borealis, the Northern Crown, visible even today. It was a gesture both romantic and eternal, a gift that would outlast even the gods themselves. Zeus, seeing his son's genuine devotion to Ariadne, granted her immortality, according to most sources. She became a goddess, sometimes called Thyone in certain traditions, though more commonly she retained the name Ariadne in her divine form. She bore Dionysus several children who became significant figures. Oenopion, associated with winemaking and said to have ruled Chios; Staphylos, whose name connects to grapes; Thoas, who became a king; and others, including Peparethus, in various accounts. Unlike Zeus's many affairs, which typically ended in tragedy or abandonment, Dionysus's marriage to Ariadne endured. They were depicted together in countless works of ancient art, shown celebrating, traveling, ruling jointly over the mysteries of wine and rebirth. Ariadne became associated with the Bacchic mysteries, presiding over certain secret rites. She was the Lady of the Labyrinth, transformed into the Lady of Divine Ecstasy, her story one of redemption and transformation. But there are darker versions of Ariadne's story preserved in some sources. Homer's Odyssey mentions that Artemis killed Ariadne on Naxos at Dionysus's testimony, though the reasons remain unclear. Some later writers suggested she and Theseus had profaned a sacred grove. Other traditions claim she died in childbirth after Theseus left her pregnant. If these versions hold truth, then Dionysus's love story becomes more complex. He would have descended into the underworld to retrieve her soul, much as he later did for his mother Semele, and brought her to Olympus as a resurrected goddess. This would make her transformation from mortal to divine harder won, a conquest over death itself rather than a simple gift. This darker version actually makes Dionysus's love more profound. He didn't just find a pretty princess and make her immortal on a whim. He fought for her, descended into death itself, and brought her back to life. She was his Eurydice, except unlike Orpheus, Dionysus succeeded. He reclaimed his love from death and made her divine. Either way, Ariadne's story with Dionysus represents something rare in Greek mythology, a relationship based on mutual choice and lasting devotion. She wasn't seduced under false pretenses or assaulted by a god in disguise. She chose him, consciously, after experiencing mortal love's failure. And he chose her, not for a night or a season, but forever. Their union also demonstrates Dionysus's capacity for mercy and compassion. Yes, he could be terrifying in his vengeance. Yes, he could drive people to madness and destruction. But he could also recognize suffering, offer comfort, provide second chances. The god who tore Pentheus apart was also the god who rescued Ariadne from despair. Both sides were equally true, equally essential to understanding who Dionysus was. Journey to the underworld. The relationship between Dionysus and the underworld ran deeper than most people realize. Unlike other Olympian gods who avoided Hades' realm whenever possible, Dionysus descended multiple times, for multiple reasons. His connection to death and rebirth, to transformation and resurrection, made him one of the few deities comfortable navigating that dark kingdom. His most famous journey to the underworld was to retrieve his mother, Semele, After establishing his divinity beyond question, after punishing those who denied him and rewarding those who honored him, Dionysus turned his attention to an old wound. His mother had died giving birth to him, or rather, giving him his first birth. She had been consumed by Zeus's divine glory, her body reduced to ash. Her soul, like all mortal souls, had descended to Hades' realm, and Dionysus intended to bring her back. This wasn't a rescue mission born of desperation or grief, at least not primarily. By the time Dionysus decided to retrieve Semele, he was a fully recognized god, secure in his power and position. But the old injustice lingered. His mother had suffered because of her relationship with Zeus, had paid the ultimate price for loving a god. Her sisters had slandered her memory. Her son had become divine while she remained among the dead. Dionysus decided this was unacceptable. The journey to the underworld was no simple task, even for a god. You couldn't just walk through the front door of Hades' palace and make demands. There were protocols, ancient laws governing who could enter and leave that realm. The dead were meant to stay dead. Exceptions were rare and required either Hades' permission or the kind of power that made permissions irrelevant. Different sources describe different versions of Dionysus' descent. Some say he entered through a bottomless pool in the Argolid, diving into dark waters that led to the realm of shades. Others mention a secret entrance only he knew, revealed to him by those who practiced his mysteries. In all versions, he arrived in the underworld with his characteristic confidence and charm. Meeting with Hades, Lord of the Dead, could have gone poorly. Hades was not known for flexibility or sentiment. His realm had rules, and those rules were absolute. But Dionysus was persuasive. He was, after all, the god of masks and performances, of transformation and negotiation. And he had something Hades wanted: knowledge of the mysteries, secrets of wine and ecstasy that even the dead might appreciate. The exact terms of any bargain between Dionysus and Hades aren't recorded in the surviving sources. Ancient writers alluded to negotiations, to exchanges, but the specifics were either lost or kept deliberately vague as part of the mystery traditions. What we know is that Hades agreed, and Semele was permitted to leave the realm of the dead. Dionysus brought Semele back from death. When mother and son reunited, it must have been overwhelming. She had died carrying him in her womb, never seeing what he would become. He had grown to godhood without ever knowing her. Now they stood together, both divine, both bearing the scars of Zeus's love and Hera's hatred. Zeus, witnessing this reunion, granted Semele full immortality and a place on Olympus. She was renamed Thyone, which means the frenzied one, or the inspired one, a name linking her to her son's realm of divine madness. She became a goddess in her own right, presiding over the Bacchic frenzy that seized her son's worshippers. This rescue resonated deeply with Dionysus's followers. Here was proof that the god understood loss, that he valued family, that he could triumph over death itself. The mystery cults that formed around Dionysus often included promises of life after death, of resurrection or privileged status in the underworld, and they pointed to Semele as evidence. If Dionysus could bring his mother back from death, what might he do for his faithful worshippers? The underworld theme ran through Dionysian worship in other ways too. The god himself was sometimes described as having died and been resurrected. Orphic traditions told of an earlier Dionysus, son of Zeus and Persephone, who was torn apart by titans and then brought back to life. Whether this was the same Dionysus or a previous incarnation depended on which theological school you followed, but the pattern was consistent: death, dismemberment, resurrection, renewal. This made Dionysus unique among the Olympians. Zeus wielded lightning, but didn't understand mortality. Athena was wise, but had never been vulnerable. Apollo was brilliant, but distant. Dionysus had tasted death, in a sense, through his mother's sacrifice and his own peculiar birth. He had journeyed to the land of the dead and returned. He understood the boundary between life and death in ways his fellow gods simply couldn't. This knowledge influenced his worship. The Dionysian mysteries promised not just ecstatic experience in life, but hope for death. His followers believed that through initiation into his rites, through experiencing the God-given madness and emerging renewed, they were rehearsing their own future resurrection. The sparagmos, the ritual tearing apart of the sacrifice, represented death. The omophagia, the eating of raw flesh, represented new life emerging from death. It was a theological revolution wrapped in wine-soaked celebration, and at its center was a god who had rescued his mother from oblivion, who had proven that death was not necessarily final, who offered his followers the same transformation he had experienced himself. Of all Dionysus's gifts to humanity, perhaps none was more culturally transformative than theatre. The connection between the god of wine and the dramatic arts might not seem obvious at first, but it runs deep, rooted in the very nature of what Dionysus represented: transformation, the wearing of masks, the ability to become someone or something else. Theatre in ancient Greece began as ritual, specifically as part of festivals honoring Dionysus. The Great Dionysia in Athens, held each spring, became the premier cultural event where the entire city gathered to honor the god through dramatic performances, competitions, and shared celebration. The origins likely trace back to dithyramb, choral hymns sung and danced in Dionysus's honor. These performances involved groups of men, sometimes dressed as satyrs, singing about the god's myths and adventures. The performances had ecstatic elements, incorporating masks, costumes, and the spirit of Dionysian worship. But sometime in the 6th century BCE, according to tradition, a significant innovation occurred. A performer named Thespis is credited with stepping out from the chorus and speaking as an individual character, creating dialogue with the chorus leader. Whether Thespis was the actual first actor or simply became the legendary embodiment of this innovation, the result was transformative. Suddenly, performance became drama, narration became enactment. This innovation spread rapidly through Athens and beyond. Playwrights began writing tragedies that explored mythological stories, human nature, the relationship between gods and mortals. These weren't simple retellings. They were examinations, interrogations, philosophical explorations, using drama as the vehicle. And they were all performed at festivals of Dionysus. Think about what this meant. The god of transformation, of losing yourself to divine madness, became the patron of an art form based entirely on transformation and impersonation. Actors wore masks, literally becoming other people, other gods, other creatures. The audience willingly suspended their disbelief, accepting the theatrical reality while knowing it was performance. The boundary between real and artificial blurred, just as it did in Dionysian worship. The theatre of Dionysus in Athens, built into the southern slope of the Acropolis, eventually accommodated somewhere around 15,000 to 17,000 spectators, though estimates vary. During the Great Dionysia, much of the citizen population would gather for multiple days of performances, tragedies typically presented in the morning, comedies in the afternoon, and satyr plays serving as shorter, lighter interludes. The best tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, all wrote with Dionysus in mind. Their plays were offerings to the god, competitions held in his honor. Victory meant your work had pleased both the god and the populace. Defeat was both artistic and religious failure. Euripides' The Bacchae, which we discussed earlier, was particularly meta in this regard. It's a play about Dionysus performed at a festival of Dionysus, warning about what happens when you deny Dionysus, staged in Dionysus's own theatre. The god was audience, subject, patron, and judge simultaneously. This connection between Dionysus and theatre wasn't limited to Athens. Wherever Greek culture spread, theatres followed, and those theatres were invariably associated with Dionysus. His image adorned theatre spaces. Sacrifices were made to him before performances. Actors and playwrights invoked his name for inspiration and protection. The masks used in Greek theatre had their own Dionysian significance. In his worship, masks allowed participants to become the god's vessel, to be possessed by divine madness, while maintaining enough separation to return to themselves afterward. In theatre, masks allowed actors to become characters, to explore human nature from multiple perspectives, to embody both hero and villain, man and woman, god and mortal. Comedy, too, was sacred to Dionysus, though in different ways than tragedy. Comedic performances, especially during festivals like the Lenaea held in winter, featured phallus processions, obscene jests, and satirical mockery of prominent citizens. This too was Dionysian, the overturning of normal social order, the license to speak forbidden truths, the celebration of bodily pleasure, and the ridiculous aspects of human nature. Aristophanes, the great comic playwright, filled his works with references to Dionysus and wine. His play, The Frogs, literally features Dionysus as a character, descending to the underworld to bring back a great tragedian, because the living playwrights aren't good enough anymore. It's comedy, satire, and theological commentary all at once. Through theatre, Dionysus gave humanity a safe space for transformation. You could explore violence without committing it. You could experience madness without losing your mind permanently. You could become someone else for a few hours and then return to yourself, enriched by the journey. It was controlled chaos, sanctioned transgression, divine madness with an intermission and a way home afterward. This made theatre both religious experience and civic education. Athenians learned their mythology through these performances. They grappled with moral questions, political dilemmas, the nature of justice and fate and free will. They saw their own society reflected back at them, sometimes flattering, more often critical. And all of it under the watchful gaze of Dionysus, the god who understood better than any other that identity was fluid, that the line between reality and performance was thinner than most people believed, that sometimes you had to lose yourself to find truth. The festivals and celebrations beyond theatre. Dionysus's festivals shaped the rhythm of ancient Greek life. These weren't solemn, quiet affairs. They were explosions of energy, release from the normal constraints of existence, sanctioned opportunities to lose control under divine protection. The rural Dionysia, celebrated in winter throughout the countryside, featured processions carrying a phallus as a symbol of fertility and the god's life-giving power. Farmers would parade through villages with songs, jests, and ritual mockery. It was earthy, unrefined by urban standards, and considered essential to ensuring agricultural prosperity. The Lanaya, held in Athens during winter, focused more on wine and theatrical performances, particularly comedy. It was a citizen festival, smaller and more intimate than the great Dionysia. Here, the emphasis was on wine making and the god's role as liberator from winter's gloom. The Anthesteria, a 3-day spring festival, had more complex layers. The first day, Pythagogia, involved opening the wine jars from the previous autumn and offering first taste to Dionysus. The second day, Choas, featured drinking competitions and celebration. But the third day, Chitroi took a darker turn, dedicated to the dead with offerings of cooked vegetables to departed souls, giving the festival an element of honoring both life and death, wine and ghosts. This mixing of celebration and death, of wine and ghosts, was quintessentially Dionysian. The god who could bring joy could also acknowledge sorrow. The wine that liberated could also commemorate loss. But the great Dionysia, held in early spring, was the peak of Dionysian worship in Athens. It lasted 6 days and transformed the entire city. Foreign dignitaries attended, business virtually stopped. The treasury was opened, and money was displayed to impress visitors. Prisoners were temporarily released to participate. Orphans of war were paraded, their maintenance by the state announced publicly. And at the center of everything, theater. Playwrights competed, typically presenting 3 tragedies and a satyr play each, performed over the course of 3 days. Victory brought prestige, an ivy crown sacred to Dionysus and lasting recognition from both god and community. Defeat meant your work, though performed, would fade from immediate memory, preserved only if someone thought it worthy of copying. The satyr plays deserve particular attention. These shorter pieces featured choruses of satyrs, those perpetually aroused half-goat companions of Dionysus. The plots drew from mythology but treated their subjects with deliberate crudeness and humor. Heroes would be mocked, gods would behave inappropriately, and everyone would engage in exaggerated drinking and chasing. It was mythology approached through comedy and obscenity, and it was considered properly sacred to Dionysus. Because Dionysus understood something profound, the sacred and the profane weren't opposites. They were 2 sides of the same coin. You could honor the gods through reverent hymns and through dirty jokes. Both access something true about human nature and divine power. The festivals also featured processions, the Pompeii, where a statue of Dionysus would be carried through the city, accompanied by celebrants in costume, musicians, animals for sacrifice. The god himself was made present through ritual, through performance, through the collective belief and participation of the community. Women played crucial roles in these festivals, though their participation varied by event. In some rites, they were the primary celebrants, the only ones allowed to perform certain rituals. In others, they participated alongside men, unusual in a society that generally segregated the sexes. This too was Dionysian, the breaking down of normal boundaries, the temporary suspension of social rules. The festivals weren't just entertainment or religious obligation. They were pressure valves for a society that otherwise maintained strict hierarchies and rigid social codes. For a few days, you could lose control in acceptable ways. You could drink more than usual, speak more freely, cross boundaries that were normally forbidden. And because it was all in service to Dionysus, because it was sanctioned by the state and the gods, it was safe, mostly. There were still limits, of course. The Greeks weren't advocating complete chaos. The festivals had structures, rules, designated times and places. But within those structures, genuine transgression was possible, and that combination, safety and danger, control and release, was what made Dionysian worship so appealing and so necessary. Acceptance among the gods. For all his influence in the mortal world, Dionysus's position on Olympus was complicated. He was the youngest of the 12 Olympian gods, a late addition to the pantheon. More troubling, he was the only Olympian with a mortal mother, a fact that the other gods never let him forget completely. Some sources hint at resistance when Dionysus first sought to join the Olympians. The objection would have centered on his mixed heritage, gods questioning whether someone with a mortal parent truly belonged among the full immortals. This would explain why his worldwide journey establishing worship wasn't just about mortals, but about proving himself to the divine community as well. The punishments of Pentheus and Lycurgus and the others weren't just vengeance, they were resume building. Look, Dionysus was saying to his divine family, I can drive mortals mad, destroy kings, establish worship that spans continents. I am a god in full, regardless of my mother's mortality. Eventually, acceptance came. According to tradition, Hestia, goddess of the hearth, yielded her seat among the 12 to make room for Dionysus. The reasons behind her decision aren't fully explained in surviving sources, though we might infer she preferred her quieter role tending the sacred fire to the more active political involvement required of the 12. With this change, Dionysus officially became one of the 12 Olympians, with a throne in Zeus's palace and a voice in divine councils. But he remained different from his siblings. Athena, Apollo, Artemis, they were born divine from divine parents. They never questioned their right to their positions. Dionysus had clawed his way up from a traumatic birth, through madness and wandering, through proving himself over and over. He earned what the others simply inherited. This gave him a unique perspective among the gods. He understood struggle in ways they didn't. He knew what it felt like to be rejected, to have your very existence questioned. He had experienced madness firsthand, both as victim and as master. He had died in a sense and been reborn multiple times. The other gods respected him, but there was always a slight wariness. Dionysus was unpredictable in ways even volatile gods like Ares weren't. Ares you could count on to be violent and straightforward. Dionysus might show up to a divine council drunk, might turn a serious discussion into theatrical performance, might respond to insults with laughter or terrible vengeance depending on his mood. His relationship with Hera improved somewhat after he achieved full Olympian status. She could no longer deny his divinity, and attacking him openly would mean challenging Zeus and the other gods who had accepted him. But the old resentment lingered. Hera would never forget that Dionysus was living proof of Zeus's infidelity, that his very existence mocked her marriage. With Zeus, Dionysus had a complicated but ultimately affectionate relationship. Zeus had literally carried him to term, had protected him as much as he could from Hera's wrath. The king of the gods was proud of his unusual son, even if he didn't always understand him. They were similar in some ways, both lovers of mortal women, both givers of gifts that could become curses. Athena seemed to appreciate Dionysus, particularly his connection to theatre and the civilizing influence of wine when properly used. They had common ground in transformation, she of wisdom and strategy, he of madness and inspiration. Both understood that sometimes you needed to become something else to achieve your goals. Apollo, god of prophecy and order, had a more ambivalent relationship with his half-brother. They represented different approaches to divinity. Apollo was all about clarity, reason, moderation, the Delphic maxim, know thyself. Dionysus was about loss of self, transcendence through abandon, the beauty of controlled chaos. They weren't exactly opposed, but they weren't natural allies either. With Hermes, Dionysus got along well. Both were travelers, crossers of boundaries, tricksters in their own ways. Hermes had even helped protect Dionysus as an infant, delivering him to the nymphs who would raise him. There was camaraderie there, a sense of being gods who operated outside the normal divine hierarchies. Dionysus's true domain, though, wasn't really Olympus. Oh, he had his throne there, attended the councils, participated in divine politics. But his heart was elsewhere, in the mountains where his maenads danced, in the theatres where mortals became heroes, and heroes became myth, in the vineyards where grapes ripened under the Mediterranean sun, in the wine shops and symposiums where humans gathered to drink and debate and connect. He was the most accessible of the Olympian gods. You didn't need a grand temple to worship Dionysus. You needed grapes and time and a willingness to lose control. His presence wasn't distant and thundering like Zeus's, or coldly perfect like Athena's. Dionysus walked among mortals regularly, in disguise or sometimes openly. He participated in his own festivals. He drank with his worshippers. This made him beloved in ways the other gods weren't. Feared, yes, respected, absolutely, but also loved. People felt they could know Dionysus in ways they could never know Zeus or Hera or Apollo. He was the god who understood what it meant to suffer, to struggle, to find joy in simple pleasures. He was divine but not distant, powerful but not incomprehensible. And in the end, that's what secured his place on Olympus. Not just his power, though he had that in abundance. Not just his parentage, though being Zeus's son certainly helped. But his relevance. Humans needed Dionysus. They needed wine for their symposiums and sacrifices. They needed theatre for their cultural and spiritual education. They needed the permission to occasionally lose themselves, to escape the grinding difficulty of mortal existence. The other Olympians could be distant and still be worshipped. Dionysus had to be present, or his worship lost its meaning. And that presence, that accessibility, made him indispensable. You couldn't run Greek civilization without Dionysus, not once he'd introduced his gifts. Remove wine and theatre and ecstatic worship from ancient Greece, and you removed something fundamental to what made them Greek. So they accepted him, the twice-born god, the foreigner, the one who was both Olympian and other, and Olympus, for all its divine drama and complicated family dynamics, was stronger for having him. The mystery cults beyond the public festivals and theatrical performances, Dionysus was also central to something more secretive, more profound, and potentially more transformative: the mystery cults. These weren't public affairs. They were initiatory religions that promised special knowledge, privileged afterlife status, and direct experience of the divine. The Dionysian mysteries shared some similarities with other mystery cults, like those at Eleusis, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone. But they had their own character, their own promises, their own secrets that initiates swore never to reveal. What we know about these mysteries comes from fragments, from comments by ancient writers, from art that hints at secret rites. The full details were lost when the last initiates died, taking their oaths of secrecy to the grave. But we can piece together some elements. The mysteries involved initiation ceremonies that could last days. Candidates would undergo purifications, ritual cleansing, designed to prepare them for divine encounter. They would fast or eat only specific foods. They would learn sacred stories not known to the general public, deeper layers of Dionysus's mythology that explained his true nature and purpose. At some point in the initiation, there would be a dramatic revelation, the showing of sacred objects or the experiencing of a vision that fundamentally changed the initiate's understanding. This might involve actual hallucination induced by substances unknown to us now, or it might be purely psychological, the result of ritual buildup and expectation, creating genuine religious experience. The mysteries promise that initiates would have a better fate after death, not heaven in the Christian sense, but a privileged position in the underworld, possibly even eventual resurrection or reincarnation in better circumstances. Dionysus, after all, had conquered death by rescuing his mother and Ariadne. His initiates believed he could do the same for them. This was revolutionary theology for the ancient world. The traditional Greek view of the afterlife was bleak. Everyone, hero and villain alike, ended up as pale shades in Hades' realm, their consciousness diminished, their former glories meaningless. The Homeric afterlife was something to be avoided as long as possible, not something to look forward to. The mysteries offered an alternative. Through initiation, through understanding Dionysus's secrets, through experiencing sacred death and rebirth in ritual form, you could transform your ultimate fate. You could escape the common lot of humanity. Orphism, a related theological movement, told even wilder stories about Dionysus. In Orphic mythology, there had been an earlier Dionysus, son of Zeus and Persephone, who was torn apart by Titans while still a child. Zeus destroyed the Titans with lightning, and from their ashes, humanity was created. This meant humans carried both divine essence from Dionysus and earthly wickedness from the Titans. The point of Orphic practice was to purify the divine spark, to free it from material corruption. Whether this earlier Dionysus was the same as the son of Semele or a different deity entirely depended on which Orphic teacher you asked. But the pattern was consistent: dismemberment, death, resurrection, renewal. Dionysus's essence couldn't be destroyed, only transformed, and his worshippers could participate in that transformation. The mystery cults weren't for everyone. Initiation could be expensive. The time commitment was significant. You had to prove yourself worthy, demonstrate commitment, pass through challenging ordeals. But for those who succeeded, who became full initiates, the rewards were immense. You joined a community that transcended normal social boundaries. Slaves and free, men and women, Greek and barbarian, all could be initiates, all equal in the eyes of the god. You learned secrets that non-initiates would never know. You experienced divine madness in controlled sacred circumstances, enough to transform your consciousness without destroying your life. You gained confidence that death was not the end, that your devotion to Dionysus would be rewarded in the next life. And perhaps most importantly, you directly experienced the god, not through prayer at a distance, not through offerings and hoping for favor, but through ecstatic union, through possession, through becoming, however briefly, a vessel for Dionysian power. This direct experience was both the mystery's greatest appeal and their greatest danger. It was one thing to worship gods from a safe distance, offering sacrifices and following rules. It was quite another to invite a god into your consciousness, to let divine madness consume you. Not everyone came back from that experience intact. The mysteries had safeguards, structures, experience guides who could help navigate the dangerous waters of divine possession. But accidents happened. People were driven permanently mad. Others became so addicted to the ecstatic experience they couldn't function in normal life. Still others gained genuine spiritual insight that made them incompatible with conventional society. The Dionysian mysteries persisted for centuries, spreading throughout the Greek world and beyond. When Rome encountered them, Roman authorities were alternately fascinated and terrified. The Bacchanalia, as Romans called Dionysian worship, seemed to promote everything Rome's rigid social hierarchy opposed: mixing of classes, sexual license, secret societies, loyalty to something beyond the state. In 186 BCE, the Roman Senate cracked down on the Bacchanalia, arresting thousands, executing many, strictly limiting when and how Dionysus could be worshipped. But you can't suppress a god whose power comes from human nature itself. The mysteries continued underground, adapted, survived. Even into the Christian era, elements of Dionysian worship persisted. Early Christians borrowed some of the symbolism: wine as sacred substance, communal meals as religious ritual, death and resurrection as central theological concepts. Some scholars argue that the Christian Eucharist, the transformation of wine into divine blood, has roots in Dionysian mystery practices. The mysteries themselves gradually faded as Christianity became dominant, as the old gods were officially suppressed. The last initiates died, taking their secrets with them, but the influence remained, woven into Western religious practice and consciousness in ways we might not fully recognize. Conclusion: so who was Dionysus, the twice-born god who transcended mortality through his unique birth, the punisher of those who denied him, teaching through terror that divine power demands respect, the rescuer who brought his mother and his love back from death, the giver of wine and theatre, two of civilization's essential tools, the god of masks and transformation, of boundaries crossed and identities shed, the young god who became old, the foreign god who became essentially Greek, the god of madness who spoke profound truth. He was all of these and more. He was contradictions embodied, impossible to pin down to a single definition or purpose. That was the point. In a pantheon full of gods with clear domains and consistent natures, Dionysus was deliberately fluid, deliberately multifaceted. The myths we've explored tonight barely scratch the surface. There are hundreds more stories. Dionysus' travels through India, establishing his cult, his conflicts with other gods and heroes, his relationships with mortals beyond those we've discussed. Each city that worshipped him had its own local myths, its own variation on his story. He absorbed traditions from cultures across the ancient world, becoming a cosmopolitan deity whose worship transcended ethnic and geographic boundaries. What makes Dionysus enduring is that he represents something every human culture needs to acknowledge. We are not purely rational beings. We cannot live entirely by rules and structures and civilized behavior. Sometimes we need to dance, to sing, to lose ourselves, to experience something beyond the mundane. Every culture develops methods for this, sanctioned ways to temporarily step outside normal constraints. Dionysus was the Greeks' way of acknowledging this need, of giving it divine sanction and structure. His worship was wild, but deliberately so, chaotic, but within bounds, dangerous, but ultimately life-affirming. He offered what the other gods didn't: permission to be fully human in all our messy, complicated, contradictory glory. The ancient Greeks are gone. Their temples are ruins. The last person who truly believed in Dionysus as a literal, personal god died centuries ago. But the god himself, or what he represented, hasn't disappeared. He's there every time someone raises a glass in celebration, every time an actor puts on a mask and becomes someone else, every time we gather with others to temporarily shed our daily personas and just be. Dionysus taught that transformation was possible, that death wasn't necessarily final, that joy and madness were flip sides of the same divine coin. These lessons remain relevant because human nature hasn't fundamentally changed. We still struggle with the same questions the ancient Greeks did. How do we balance civilization and wildness? How do we honor both reason and passion? How do we live meaningful lives in the shadow of inevitable death? Dionysus doesn't provide easy answers. He never did. Instead, he offers experiences: the wine that loosens tongues and reveals truth, the theater that shows us ourselves, the ecstatic worship that hints at something transcendent. These aren't answers, but invitations, chances to explore these questions ourselves through direct experience rather than abstract philosophy. And perhaps that's the most lasting aspect of his legacy. Dionysus didn't demand belief so much as participation. He didn't require you to understand him intellectually, only to experience him directly. Drink the wine, watch the play, dance the dance, and in doing so, discover something about yourself you didn't know was there. So as we close this long exploration of the god of wine and ecstasy, of madness and theater, of death and rebirth, remember this: Dionysus' story isn't really about him. It's about us, about the parts of ourselves we suppress in daily life, about the potential for transformation we all carry, about the thin line between control and chaos, and the courage it takes to approach that line deliberately. The god born twice, who died and returned, who conquered death and brought others back from its grip, who gave humanity wine and theater and the permission to occasionally lose ourselves. This god remains present, not in a temple or on a throne, but in our celebrations and our art, in our need for release and our capacity for transformation. So raise a glass, metaphorically or literally, not to worship a deity from a dead religion, but to honor what he represented: the wild joy of being alive, the liberation of letting go, the courage to transform. To Dionysus, who understood that sometimes you have to lose yourself to find yourself. To the god who taught that civilization needs its moments of sanctioned chaos, its breaks from order, its spaces for becoming something more or different or simply other. And with that, we close this chapter of ancient stories. If these tales brought you peace or insight or simply a pleasant journey through old myths, consider liking and subscribing. Let us know in the comments which god or hero we should explore next, which stories still call to you across the centuries. Sleep well, knowing that the old gods, though perhaps not literally real, represented something eternally true about human nature and human needs. And in the morning, when you return to your ordinary life with its ordinary demands, maybe carry a little bit of Dionysus with you. Not the madness or the vengeance, but the joy, the permission to transform, the knowledge that you are more than your daily routine, more complex than your social role, capable of experiences that transcend the mundane. That's the gift Dionysus offers across millennia. Not answers, but experiences. Not certainty, but transformation. Not safety, but the wild, beautiful, dangerous journey of being fully, completely, messily human. Good night, and may your dreams be touched by divine madness, just enough to refresh your soul, not enough to destroy your mind. That balance, that perfect Dionysian balance between chaos and control, between transformation and return. That's the real lesson. That's the real gift. Sleep well.